You check your bank account. The number is lower than you would like. It is lower than you think it should be. Again, you tell yourself it is because you did not earn enough this month. You tell yourself it is unfair perhaps. It is not really. Someone right this moment in this universe is staring at a similar number in their bank account and thinking about it in an entirely different way. Not because they have more money. Not because they are substantially wealthier on a sliding scale, but because they think about money in an entirely different way. You were taught to think of money as a reward. Good work, good reward. Spend the reward wisely, hope that it lasts. It is an entirely intuitive way to think about money, and most would say that it is fair. It is also in many ways backwards. It is backwards, writes a large body of economic research on the accumulation of wealth, in many ways entirely wrong. The strange thing is, rich people think about money as reward in much the same way as everyone else does, with an important difference. In their heads, the reward is not the end, as it is for most people. It is merely a medium, a means to an end. Here is the huge and important difference between most people and the wealthy. Let's revisit the 18th century. In Ireland and France, Richard Cantillon was beginning his work as an economist. In his writings, he discussed the strange ways in which money influenced the wider economy, particularly when it was introduced. Money, he wrote, when injected into an economy, for instance, created by a ruler and distributed out to the public, would affect different classes of people differently. This was because the new money entered the economy from a single source. This meant that the people closest to that source, the ruling class, had access to the new money before anyone else, and therefore could use the new money to buy goods and services at cheaper rates. This effect continues to reverberate throughout the economy, with the people closest to the source of the money faring better than those further away. This is called the Cantillon effect, and it is an economic law with real-world implications. The important thing to note is that money is not entirely distributed evenly, and the people who hold the money have an advantage over the people who do not. Modern economics has moved far beyond Cantillon's early work, but the principles remain much the same. In place of monarchs and gold, we have central banks and credit. The money still comes from one source, however, and it still has different effects on different classes of people. It is far easier, if you are an investor, to buy commodities at a lower price than most would pay. This is the easiest way to observe the Cantillon effect in day-to-day life, in the prices of things and the different ways they affect people. Now here is the strange thing. Two people can be subjected to the same forces in the economy and end up in very different places due to the way they think about money. The way most people think about money is as income. You receive it and you spend it. The way richer people think about money, the ones who are far less affected by the Cantillon effect, is as assets. They think about how money can affect their existing holdings, rather than how those holdings can affect the money they possess. That is the essential difference between income thinking and asset thinking in a single sentence. It is also not the whole truth, not necessarily. It is obvious to most observers that rich people tend to accumulate wealth more quickly and hold on to it with greater tenacity than average earners. There is a principle at work, one that helps explain much of the phenomena discussed thus far. The man named Benjamin Graham, mentor to Warren Buffett and renowned economist in his own right, spent much of his professional career investigating the ways in which intelligent people could be led astray by their own minds. His conclusion, stated most succinctly in his book The Intelligent Investor, was that the single greatest threat to a successful investment was the investor himself. That may sound surprising. It should not be. It is an established fact, backed by hundreds if not thousands of hours of research, that people are disproportionately affected by the prospect of loss. A loss of a given amount of money feels, psychologically, far worse than an equivalent gain feels good. That is called loss aversion, and it is one of the central tenets of behavioral economics. It has been observed in humans and other animals, and it has real neurological grounding. Losses trigger far stronger negative emotions than gains trigger positive emotions. This can affect people in strange ways. Keeping cash on hand, for instance, rather than investing it because it is already there. It can mean paying off minor debts before making an investment, out of sheer psychological disgust with owing money in general. Rich people feel these emotions just as acutely as everyone else does. The only difference is that they do not let them dictate their actions. They recognize them for what they are and move on. Daniel Kahneman, one of the pioneers of behavioral economics and a collaborator with famed economist Amos Tversky, was a strong proponent of this view of economics. He put forward a theory called mental accounting, which stated that people mentally labeled money in different ways, depending on how they obtained it. This in turn affected how they spent it afterwards. People were much more likely to spend found money on found things, for instance, rather than using cash for something they actively bought. This is an entirely reasonable way to think about money, with one major caveat. Rich people think about money in this way too. They have learned over time to separate their spending from these mental associations. They know that a dollar is a dollar, no matter where it comes from. This is a vital difference because it affects everything from day-to-day spending to long-term investment strategies. Let's think about debt for a moment. You were probably taught as a child that debt is a bad thing, period. That is not an entirely unreasonable thing to say, assuming that you are talking about consumer debt. When it comes to things like mortgages, for instance, debt is actually a tool to build long-term wealth. It is an interesting perspective to consider, perhaps, when examining the wealth-building habits of the rich. They do not think about debt being good or bad, really. They understand the principles behind it, and they use it as a tool, much like any other financial instrument. During the Great Depression, thousands of banks around the country collapsed. People watched in horror as their life savings vanished into thin air. The real problem, from the perspective of the average investor, was that they had placed large amounts of their wealth in cash. This was a disaster because the value of cash plummeted along with the markets. The people who suffered the most, ironically, were those who sought to make the market fall less severe than it ultimately became. They borrowed massively, hoping to pay back the loans later with cash, which became utterly worthless in the end. People who understood leverage, however, did not make those kinds of mistakes. It is an interesting perspective to consider if you have never heard it before. It is even more interesting to consider the implications. Wealthy people, for instance, do not make impulsive investments. They understand the markets and the forces acting upon them. In many ways, this is what makes them wealthy. They study those forces and they understand how best to use them in their favor. Most importantly, as mentioned above, they understand the way they react to them emotionally. They recognize that the market, in times of panic, often does stupid things. In times of panic, people tend to sell things off far below their actual value just to get rid of them. The smartest investors do not listen to their emotions. They wait until the market stabilizes, until they can predict what will happen next with a reasonable degree of certainty. Wealthy people have long understood that the best time to invest is when everyone else is doing the opposite. Panic causes people to do crazy things. Sell their shares of an apparently failing company outright, for instance, or borrow money they don't really need. Those are the times for calm contemplation, for looking ahead and figuring out what to do next. Emotion is the enemy of long-term wealth building, as is impatience. The two are rarely found in the same room as rich people, because most wealthy individuals realize that investing is a long-term game. There are plenty of people who set aside money, month after month, and wait for the right time to reinvest. There are many fewer people who do those things and continue them right through the market crash. The difference between them is often measured in wealth. Warren Buffett has long spoken about the concept of temperament as the most important skill an investor can have, the ability to not be swayed by the irrational impulses of others. He has said that it is not intelligence, really, that determines whether a person will be successful or not. It is merely the ability to temper one's emotions. You do not need a degree in finance to understand investing. You need a strong enough mind to resist the impulses of the herd. One can argue, perhaps, that it is the single most important skill in all of finance. It may be in many ways the most important skill in all of life. The market is not the only place where emotions lead people astray, after all, but that is getting ahead of ourselves slightly. There is one more important difference to discuss, in many ways, between the financial outlooks of most people and the wealthy. Rich people do not think about money the way most people do. To rephrase that thought, they do not think about money as an end. They think about money as a means. It is a strange thing to consider, perhaps, but it is an established fact that wealthy people tend to think about money in different contexts than everyone else. Most people think about how much money they have. Rich people think about how much money they are going to have. Most people think about their current wealth in terms of status. Rich people think about the same figures in terms of optionality. Money gives them options over their lives, and they understand the power of that in ways most people do not. That single thought process dictates much of what they do with their money. It influences what things they buy, and it influences where they invest. It even influences the way they hold money in many cases. Most people, when talking about money, think of income as an end goal. The rich think of it as a starting point. You were taught as a child to think about money as an end goal. They were taught, or taught themselves, to think about money as something that lasts far beyond their natural life. The next time you check your bank account, perhaps you will wonder if you were taught to think about it correctly.